Yay. All right, we're growing in numbers. There's going to be, I think, about 40 people. So let's just see those numbers grow. If there's anyone waiting to come into the meeting, please let me know. So this is our topic of conversation, and I wanted to break it down into, what is the actual ego? Because a lot of us, we hear this word, and I'm certainly not an expert. I haven't done a master's in psychology and studied the ego at brilliant lengths, but I've come across it in pretty much every part of my 25 years in this industry. And it's simply, in a very simple term, I'm going to get more complex with it, but it's a person's sense of self-esteem or self-importance at a very basic level. However, if you look at the psychology or the psychoanalysis behind it, it's considered a part of the mind that mediates between the conscious and the unconscious, and kind of tries to reality test what we're experiencing in life and whether that matches what we think our personal identity is. So that's really interesting. I saw that description and I was like, oh, that's interesting. So if the mind is trying to mediate, or if the ego is trying to mediate between conscious and unconscious, they're missing a whole chunk of our spiritual self in that process, hence the battle. I've also heard it described as the ego as part of our personality that helps us make practical, rational decisions, which, practical and rational can be really useful, but it can be very inhibiting. But it acts as a middle ground, which balances your instincts and desires, which is these primal needs we have, with morals and our conscience, which is the super ego. So it's almost like our learned standards of what we think we should be, or our primal instincts of what we really want. From almost a reptilian brain example, it's trying to balance that. And that's tricky, because what if we've learned something that isn't right for us? Then we're in this kind of stuck space. And obviously, Sigmund Freud was the person that first talked about it, but I'm sure it's been known as a different name for a lot longer than that. So what really it comes down to is the ego is a structured model on how we think we should interact with the world. And of course, as you know, that comes from so many areas in our life. It's how we think we should interact, not how we naturally might. It's how we think we should. And I'm not anti the ego, by the way. The ego can be powerful in your life, of course. So these are all very limited mind-based concepts. But for most of us, our ego is developed out of trauma-informed moments, or difficult moments, or social programming, whatever you want to call that, where you really didn't know what and who you were as a spiritual creator being. Think about that. Our ego has been developed out of either stress or experiences, or at least in a platform where we didn't actually know who we were at a bigger level, because it's only in the mind that the ego exists. It doesn't exist in spirit. So it kind of brings back that concept of dreamed versus dreamt, or dreamer versus dreamt, I should say, more than anything. So, are we responsible for creating our own reality, or is it someone else's reality we're living in? So in my mind, egos can often be, they're not always, by the way, often be the inhibitor rather than a useful mediator. So it's considered a mediator, but it's often the inhibitor. Hence, I think the critical nature of spiritual healing, or connecting to something greater than just the mind, because we are more than the mind. We are greater than just the mind and the body. And to try and alchemize any of those trauma-informed moments, because those trauma-informed moments are giving the ego some structure and operational, it's like an operating manual. So yeah, we don't want that. We don't want trauma-informed moments to decide how we run our life. Which then leads us to the question, how does the ego connect and integrate to our spirit? Well, for those of you that have done my coaching class, you'll have heard me talk about the Antakarana, which is the spirit bridge. So, the spirit bridge is, it's a Hindu term that basically says it's a link between our higher self, mind, spirit, and our lower mind, our ego identity. So what that really says is that we're standing on a bridge, and we as a spiritual being are walking across that bridge. And on the other side of the bridge is the everyday world, the everyday mundane world where we interact, we transact, we talk to people, we connect. And as we walk across that bridge, how much of our spirit and higher mind is translated into the world without the corruption of the ego? Because that's really the idea of the Antakarana. problems arise when we're trying to translate our beautiful, natural, spiritual self into the everyday world. But the ego, if it's is either corrupted, hidden, or not expressed. So that's the issue. Is when there's a mask, a shadow, or a fracture in that translation from spirit self into the everyday world. And as we know, a house divided against itself shall fall. If we are split, so how we think we should show up isn't how we really want to, then we have a duality. And what corrupts that translation? Like I said, shadow, yours, other people's, family, culture, society, what we're expected to do, what we're not expected to do, what we've learned, what we think is normal. I was speaking to someone this morning that had a very abusive childhood, and she learned very early that she had to be super independent, like super, like you can't rely on anyone else. Everything falls back to yourself, super independent. So what that means is that she can't really get support or help, or she always has people mess up. Like she's, always having things that happen that mess up her ability to get on with life because she's expecting it. So her ego has a lens of you can't trust anyone. And in her childhood, she couldn't, abusive family. So it's really interesting how we develop these parts of ourselves and the masks that we think we should or shouldn't wear. So our job is to reset the lens of the ego. We don't hate the ego. There's good parts to the ego as well, by the way, positive reinforcement, but we need to reset the lens of how we're operating and seeing the ego. And to try and lead from spirit, heart, kindness, freedom, whatever that is for you, whatever your core spiritual values are, to try and lead from there, not the reactive and corrupted and fractured mind. Now, we know we have fractures in the mind, micro and macro. If you look at what's happening in the world, there's fracture, but there's also beauty. So somewhere in the world, there's beauty, spirit, heart, kindness operating, and then there's the man's corrupted, fractured mind, hence wars and division. So I think we've got to remember. I think we've got to remember that, yeah, we've got both. So we really need to employ the ego where it's best fits. And the way I see it, it's the worker bee, not the CEO. It's not running the ship. It's working in the ship. Because the problem that a lot of us have is our ego runs it. It's like the CEO, the head of the business. And therefore it's like a 50-50 whether things go well. So we need to kind of redeploy or employ the ego where it fits best. And that's what we're going to talk about in this session. Where does it actually fit? If you've just joined, do you want to make sure you put yourself on mute, or I'll just do it for you. That's no worries. Cool. All right. So what does a healthy ego look like? It's self-aware. There is an awareness that my way or thoughts isn't always the right way. Therefore it's a growth mindset. It's like very self-aware, and it's able to reflect inwards. It's also very intentional. If we don't intend and have an intent for our ego of how we want to develop and evolve it, it will just run riot. Almost like, if you've got children in the classroom and you're like, I intend some of them to be at this PlayStation and some having a nap and some out here having a drink, everything's kind of in order. That's my intention. But if you just said, no rules, off limits, then there'd be chaos in that schoolroom with those children. Like that's kind of how simple we can talk about the ego. It knows how to have good boundaries. It knows, where to stop and start. It's not loose with boundaries. It's also very reflective and adaptable. That's what we want the ego to be. When the ego is stuck in its systems or its fractures and it can't look at itself or it can't evolve, that's the problem. So we want it to be adaptable and teachable. And we want there to be, it's listening to your higher mind. And that's mainly this talk. How does your ego listen to your higher mind for guidance? How does it actually do that in a way that's powerful? And also balanced. It wants to be, we want the ego to be balanced. It's got to, it can go both ways. It can make decisions that go both ways. It's not just one way is the right way. So what does an unhealthy ego look like? Self-absorbed, limited. It just thinks it's right. It just thinks it has all the answers. It just thinks that's the way it should be. So it's no growth. there's scattered kind of energy. It's loose or disorganized. So it's not got a mission. It's not being instructed. It's not being programmed. And an ego can't program itself. That's why we're, hence this talk today. It's programmed by a higher self or a higher mind. Loose and unclear boundaries, not having good boundaries with others is part of the issue. It doesn't really have any intentional boundaries. It's like the schoolroom analogy. It's like, oh, whatever goes, goes. That's a problem. It's fixed and fearful, stuck in time. Oh, this is what I know. This feels safe, even if it's hard. Some people just feel safe if they keep repeating the same old stories. So the ego usually likes us to feel like it knows everything and it's certain and that's it. Hasn't got to change because, change is scary for an ego. It also, it's ignored and disconnected from the higher mind, therefore it's dysregulated. Because if we just leave our ego floating around on its own and doesn't have any higher guidance, what's it got to fall back on? If something happens that's negative, it kind of self-implodes. Therefore therein lies the problem. So when people say, got a healthy ego is I'm accepting some sort of programming, direction, wisdom, and guidance from a higher part of myself. And what is that? It's certainly not the mind. Because if we default to the command center of the mind, we usually fall back to inner critic. So when you want to grow or face fear or expand or up level yourself, if you want to do something different, the unhealthy ego is a ceiling or a block for you. Like that, it gets stuck in there. So the people, when they say I'm stuck or I can't change, what they're really saying is my ego can't change. Therein lies the problem. So the ego gets out of control and unhealthy when given too much responsibility around vision or decisions. I want to read that again. It gets out of control when it's being given too much responsibility around decisions, big, cathartic, like fork in the road decisions. It's not where we employ the ego. And the reason being is because it's limited and programmed. It'll only know where to go, what it's already done. It only knows what it's already done. And when I talk about out of control, I'm kind of likening it, and everyone who knows me on this course knows I have horses. It's kind of like an out of control horse with no structure, no rails, unwrangled. So, I have rescued and rehabbed horses, and one of the things I know about them is after the initial gentleness of you're safe and there's, a feminine energy and an attention and a love, there then comes the structure, which is more what I would call the masculine, the logical structure. When they feel like they're in a structure, they're so much calmer. So an anxious horse is a horse with no structure and no safety. That's as simple as it gets. And I've done this a lot with horses, and I can see this so many times. And I made a lot of mistakes when I, first started training horses. But this is so important. And it's the same thing with our ego. Our personality, our ego will get anxious when there's not enough structure. So it becomes problematic when it's unchecked, can lead to arrogance. I think I know better, but it's not even arrogance because you're just generally arrogant. It's arrogant because it's sort of saying, well, there's only the box that I know. I think that's right. I'm not going to look for any other options, because an ego doesn't know how to look for other options. It just knows what it knows. Entitlement or a detachment from reality that causes suffering. So that's an interesting one, a detachment from reality. What you really want, what really is happening, what's happening in the field, what's happening in the world of metaphysics. It's detached from that real visceral feeling. So if we were to think about how to balance the spirit and ego, think about it, because you have to balance them. You have to get them talking. You have to get them working together. They're both important. We don't want to have no ego. We don't want to have no spirit connection. We can't reject it. We can't hate it. That's just another layer of the mind. In fact, if we hate parts of our personality or don't like the way that our ego is operating, that's your inner critic. And that comes up a lot with that term imposter syndrome. People talk about imposter syndrome. And that's just really your inner critic having a field day. It's nothing to do with whether you really hate or love yourself. It's your inner critic having a field day saying, I don't know how to fix this problem. I don't know how to feel more confident. Therefore, you must be an imposter. Therefore, you're fake and you're not authentic. It's probably the most tragic experience most of us humans have around just not believing in ourselves and the inner critic coming in and smashing us. So the idea is not to hate it, reject it, or to drop back into the inner critic. Our idea is we need to redeploy it and give it some new rules. We need to put the ego where it belongs, not hate it, not hide it away, not pretend it doesn't exist. We need to feed it positively, but we need to redeploy it. So I love this analogy. This analogy probably puts this in the most simplistic form I've ever been in for in this kind of work. Who's driving the car? So if you think about it in this term and the way that you live your life, and when I figured this out, it was just so much easier. In the driver's seat, making decisions, directing your vision and your destination should be your spirit. It's as simple as that. Make decisions, navigate forward, take those bold risks, claim what's really exciting, follow your passion in whatever form that is. That should be your spirit. In the front seat, next to the driver, the passenger, is the body. Look after your body because the spirit should be driving the car, making decisions. And every so often it looks over to the person in the front seat next to the driver, the spirit, and should say, are you doing okay, body? Are you coping? Can we keep up? Like, do you need a rest? How are you functioning? Because there has to be, we have to respect that we have a human avatar. We're in a body, we are a spirit in a body, and we've got a mind and an ego in there, but we need to sort of respect that this body needs help and attention. And then in the back seat is the mind. And I liken it to this part of you that has a little sat nav, a navigation tool, and it says, hey, spirit, where are we going? Oh, let me work out the quickest path. Or, hey, body, what do you need? Oh, let me find the right diet. It's literally meant to sit in the back, a backseat, passenger, not even a backseat driver, a backseat passenger, and say, what will you have me do, spirit? Let me do that for you. And that's kind of as simple as I can say it. Like, that's how we should be thinking about the analogy of how you drive yourself forward in life. When you adopt this policy, life becomes a lot more simple, especially when you give some attention to the body in the front seat as well. So that comes down to, you need to hire properly. You hire your mind to sit in the back seat. You make the, you as an individual decide that your spirit's the driver. If you can just make those hires properly, then you'll start to feel better about how you manage these parts of yourself because they're all important. Another way to look at it is wise guardian and excited warrior. I want you to think about those terms. The mind gets excited, the spirit doesn't. It's just a fact. Excitability and passion and drive on that level, that exciting, rushy kind of mind energy sits in mind and ego. And that's fine. It's not a bad thing. So we've got wise guardian and we've got excited warrior here. And I put this picture of this young kid because I'm like, oh, look at him. He's all stacked up with his tools. He's ready to go. And he, she, whatever, ready to go, ready to have a battle, but probably doesn't have a lot of wisdom at that age. And it's not necessarily an age thing. You can be wise, as a kid, but probably not a lot of wise direction going. So the wise guardian, aka the spirit, provides a direction to the excited warrior, aka the ego. Because this ego is young and new, and probably the ego is just in this one lifetime. Your ego right now has only had this one life experience. It's new. It's like a baby. So this new young, energy should be directed by the guardian spirit because your spirit has had many timelines, many lifetimes, so much wisdom. So the spirit should be the CEO and the excitable warrior or this young part, this ego should be a junior in the business. If you talk about business, it should be the junior. You're a junior role. You're in training. Let me direct you. Let me set the company rules. Let me tell you what to do. And what do we do with juniors in business? We train them properly. We give them exercises, we give them ideas, we give them experiences, and we hopefully grow them up into being wise leaders. And so really it's the spirit's job to then take command of the ego. But if we don't let it, that's a problem. There's a really interesting term, and you've probably heard of it. Not sure if you've delved into a term called spiritual bypassing. Spiritual bypassing is the tendency to use the idea of spirituality or practices to avoid facing uncomfortable emotions, psychological wounds, or unresolved personal issues. It was coined by psychotherapist John Wellwood in the 80s. I didn't know this till recently, but he was doing a lot of work with Buddhists in the 80s. And he was sort of talking about the fact that they bypassed a lot of their fractures and shadows to go, oh, I'm just heading toward enlightenment. If I just meditate all day and I just leave the world behind, I can just find my own enlightenment. But what he said was they were like not dealing with their messy, life experiences, or they were detaching from being human. And that's what we don't want to do. We don't want to detach from the mess of humanity because we are that and we're in it. So in many ways, he talked about the fact that sometimes we can get caught up in the blissfulness of connecting to spirit, which it is, by the way, because it does feel different in that energy. And what happens is we can go off on that tangent and live in what I call the great blue road, the world of metaphysics and spirit, and forget the great red road, the everyday life and world. And therefore we don't face up to what's really going on. So I have seen examples and you see them, by the way, you would see them in everyday life with spiritual, maybe teachers or leaders or people in that industry where they've got this beautiful, amazing spiritual teaching, but their personal lives are wrecked, really wrecked. In fact, I worked with a client of mine a long time ago, and he was like high up in a spiritual religious church. And he was considered like this amazing spiritual leader. But when he went home, he would drink like so much and game all night, and his kids and wife were going insane. He would just drown and drink himself stupid and play like gaming all night. And he was like, at the time, he was like almost 40. So I was like, wow, that's messy. That's not living like, a cohesive life. That sounds messy, and it was, and there was a lot that went down after that. But yeah, that's not facing what's real. So keeping it grounded, being practical, and addressing those issues that are causing fractures in your life and people around you is important as part of this work. And that's why when we talk about spirit and ego, it's not that we go into spirit and forget ego. We want to actually properly integrate them so that the spirit is guiding our ego, um, which is called doing the work. I need to do the work. It's also hard. I had a call this morning with someone, this beautiful woman from Alberta in Canada, and she was talking about, she's been listening to a lot of spiritual podcasts lately. And people are going, oh, I've had this spiritual awakening and it's been really blissful and it's been the best change ever. And now I'm doing, this work. And she said to me, oh, wow, that's not my experience. My spiritual awakening was really hard. It actually was cathartically really hard. And I said, actually, that's probably more realistic. If you've had a spiritual awakening or you've been launched into this work, it's probably come from a difficult time, not just, oh, I suddenly found myself and now I'm just like floating on cloud nine and I have no problems. That's actually not realistic. It's not how this work works. And the reason I can say that confidently is when you do it for 25 years and you've done over 17,000 sessions, there's nothing I haven't seen. Like it's literally, it is chunky and it is meaty and it is sometimes difficult to look at our challenges. And I still have them. I don't think we're ever just like, oh, it's love and light all the time. Yes, they're less. Yes, they're like fine tuning edges, but we have them. I really like this analogy, and it's a very unusual title: Aliens, Dogs, Lovers, and You. Probably wondering where I'm going with this. Let's talk about this whole layer of how we develop. So, doing the work says we don't leave unfinished business. We don't bypass important milestones. We don't do half-baked efforts. That's important. I'm going to say that again. We do the work and don't just leap without doing our work along the way. It's not that we have to have a hard life. It's not that you have to go through cathartic crap to be spiritual. That's not true. But you have to put money into the spiritual bank kind of thing, or energy into that bank. So my first thought is don't try to talk to aliens before you try to talk to your dog. And I heard the most interesting response once. It wasn't mine. It was it James? Someone else I was listening to. It was a spiritual teacher of some sort, and someone said, "Oh, I'm so advanced in my spiritual practice. I'm trying to communicate with the aliens from the, I don't know, 30th dimension or something." And then I think it was James that said, "Oh, mate, might want to try talking to your dog before you try and communicate to those aliens up there. Like, are you actually doing things that are in your everyday life that are meaningful and practical, that are evolving you before you go off and go, oh, I'm just going to like float up to the void and find enlightenment before I actually deal with my drinking problem?" So don't try to talk to aliens before you try to talk to your dog. Don't try to talk to your dog until you can effectively talk to your partner or your friends. Like literally, if you're going to have, interspecies communication and talk to the field or talk to do you have your own communication effectively in order? Like, can you actually communicate properly on a deep heart level first? And then the last one is don't try to talk to your partner until you can talk to yourself. If you can't have a conscious conversation and a connection to your own divine, to your own self, to your own spiritual center, if you can't do that, then don't worry about your partner or your dog or talking to aliens. Like literally start with you. And I think what's important about that is that requires you to be conscious and reflective and to sit and do that work. And that also might require you to help work through some of your shadows. Um, the amount of people that tell me they can't sit on their own and just be still and peaceful is extraordinary. Oh, I have to keep myself busy, or I can't just sit on the beach, I'm going to stress, or I have to like go out and talk to others. So there's a real thing around talking and sitting with yourself. When you find that kind of inner peace with your own self, you know that you're on the right tangent. So that's a really important part of it. Which means that you have to have some self-inquiry. So, these two beings are like physical and metaphysical. You have to have that self-inquiry. Maybe it's your ego and your spirit talking. Maybe it's your spirit like working through some of your shadows, your decisions, your beliefs, your social programs. Like social programs are so huge. What we taught, what was normal in our childhood. For some of us, it was growing up in a very religious church. For some of us, it was having parents that had no spirituality at all. And James and I, my partner and I, come from opposite ends. He grew up in strict Catholic. I grew up in like anti-religion, like nothing. There was no mystery, no magic, no connection. It was so mundane. And he grew up in a very indoctrinated church setting. So you have to undo some of these programs around how go through the world. So it's real deep self-inquiry as to what who and what you are. The thing about spirit and ego, a lot of people ask me, how do I know if it's my spirit talking to me or my ego? And the best way to start looking at that is when something goes wrong in your life or a negative curveball happens or something is challenging. It doesn't even need to be that it's gone wrong, it's challenging. Because there are two voices. There's a voice from like a higher mind or a spirit mind, and there's a voice from the ego or the lower mind. And it's only when something goes wrong it becomes more obvious. So the language of spirit and higher self is more about, you know, you failed this time rather than you're a failure. So if something happens and it didn't work out, oh, this time around it didn't work out, or there was a failure this time, rather than you're a failure generally. It's much, much more evolutionary. And it will often say something along the lines of, let's take a deeper look at where this resistance is coming from and reset. That's the kind of voice it will employ. It will actually say, hey, something's happened, something hasn't worked out. Let's look at like where that's from. Why is that repeating pattern happened again and again? It will also say who around me can support me or who has done it before, what I'm trying to achieve. It'll actually ask you to find resources. Because what does the spirit do? It goes, there's endless resources. There's resources from my higher self. There's resources from the field. There's resources from people around me. So that's the question it will ask. It will immediately go, law of meaning making. Where is it coming from? What are the patterns? Who around me can help me out of this, or how can I help myself? It will definitely ask, what did I learn? That is the number one thing a spirit self or voice will ask. Oh, what am I learning from this? Because there's an evolutionary lesson in difficulty. In fact, You could even say the harder your challenge, the greater the evolution. It's not that you need to love difficulty. It's just if you're going through something really awkward and cathartic, it's probably a big life lesson that's coming to your, to your experience. He will also tell you that creative play is more important than perfection. So your spirit self will encourage you to explore and express and dabble without this meaning making of I've got to get it right first time or it's got to be perfect. If I waited till all of my stuff was perfect before I put it online and taught courses, I'd still be bashing away on a keyboard. You wouldn't even know who I was. Like you wouldn't even be at this talk. There's probably a typo in this presentation. I did see one before, but you can't wait for perfection. Like that's not what the spirit's asking you. It wants experiential creative play. So your spirit voice is evolutionary, compassionate, and reflective. And the reason it's reflective is it wants the mind and the ego to learn and grow. It wants to give you this kind of reflection to then grow because it does want your ego to grow up. It does, especially if there's parts that are really fractured. And by the way, there's parts of the ego that are awesome too, by the way, healthy boundaries. I've got a question here. Lisa, when you put yourself into autopilot through traumatic time, is that coming from the mind ego or the higher self for protection? It could be either. So that's a really great question, Lisa. I love that question. If you're going through something traumatic, really traumatic, it's not that it's autopilot. It's actually not autopilot spirit would do. The ego might go on autopilot. The spirit or higher self would say, and this is a really good distinction, the spirit and higher self would say, what aspect of myself, because like we're a diamond, we have a lot of reflections, right? There's a lot of reflections of us. It would say, what face or reflection do I need to bring out to deal with this situation? So a great example is something traumatic. Maybe someone assaults you, maybe someone attacks you. Your spirit's not going to go, oh, well, just, we're all love and light and kindness and just do whatever. It's probably going to go put on warrior face. Boom. What have you learned to defend yourself physically, or what's warrior face? Or if someone's encroaching on a boundary, it might ask you to put on a different face that does X, Y, Z. The ego might do the autopilot. It might go, oh, I don't know how to deal with that. I'll just kind of, gloss over it. So yeah, I think there's slightly different reactions, but yeah, sometimes it's, so if I was assaulted or I was attacked, for example, and then warrior face, a warrior part of Debbie came online more, then after the event, I might come back and deal with grief or loss or fear or scared, part of me. So that's doing the work. When I've come off that immediate need, I'll then go and do the work. What a lot of us do is if something traumatic happens, we can do what the ego wanted, stay on autopilot for too long, and then we kind of numb out to it. Hopefully I've answered that question, Lisa. That's a good question. So one of the things that the language of the ego, if you think about the language of the ego, when something goes wrong, by the way, it's like if things are going well, the ego is quite happy, isn't it? It's ticking away. Oh, I'm doing good, I got a promotion or dating someone great or, got my health under control, whatever that is. It's when something goes, curveball-y that's the problem. The first thing it often jumps to is you're a failure or you failed rather than you failed this time, because this time says there's another time to succeed, whereas this often puts, oh, wow, I'm a failure at this. Sometimes it'll say you're so hopeless, I told you so. That's more of an inner critic, but like the ego might like feel hopeless, might go, oh, I knew it wouldn't work. Sometimes it can project at others. It's his fault or her fault or their fault. Sometimes it just says, let's just try something else. Oh, that didn't work. I tried to launch a spiritual business, didn't work. I'll just do something else now. Or, oh, I tried at that sport and, I wasn't great immediately. I mustn't be aligned to it. Sometimes it'll say, let's get drunk, or at least I'm just not like Lisa. Sometimes it'll project benchmarks to other people, either go and drown my sorrows, or sometimes it'll say, oh, but, I failed, but like, oh, I'm not as bad as Lisa, or I'm not as bad as my neighbor next door that has this problem. Sometimes it likes to compare to try and boost itself up. Or it'll say that's too risky because, It's just like, oh no, because what does the ego do? It's like it's got its box, this is who I am, this is what I do. So if you're saying let's do something different, that could be too risky. So there's an element of fixed, scared, and reactive when something goes wrong. It doesn't mean that when things go right, that it doesn't act well. Like the ego is, our sense of self. It's, healthy sense of self-esteem, if that is healthy. But yeah, it's certainly when something goes wrong, it doesn't react so well. So you can see the two voices. So if you're falling into the second column, then you're probably sitting in that ego mind or even reverting to inner critic, just to kind of like keep your identity intact. Because what's the main aim of the ego? My identity is intact. I need to keep my identity intact. And sometimes we just have to change. When you go through a dark night of the soul or a spiritual awakening, your identity changes. Your ego has to just drop and cave and crumble, which is scary. Myself included, it's scary to do that, especially when you have a fixed point of who you think you are. Interesting time. So ego and the law of intention, this is where it comes about being intentional. So be intentional around managing your ego. So remember we talked about the Antakarana, the spirit bridge. So think of this figure on the left-hand side where they've started from is the spirit. Like they're looking, this is my spirit, this is who I am. And they're walking across the bridge. And they're hitting shadows as they walk across the bridge. So think about it. We're trying to bridge ourselves, our authentic spirit, into our everyday mundane life through the ego. So shadows are masks that arise as you cross the bridge and translate spirit into your everyday personality. That's what happens to us all. And the ego or the fractures sitting in the ego are getting in the way of our full expression. Yeah, and I guess that's what they mean when they say an ego death. Yeah, if you have an ego death, that means you've done some sort of cathartic shift and you've killed the old version of yourself, literally. But yeah, but think about these shadows and masks. So we can do big ego deaths, like Nagas just said, which is like everything crumbles and we reset. That only happens a couple of times in our lifetime. Most of it is those shadows that sit in the field, and you can see this figure moving toward them as they bump up against them. They're annoying, like they're like, oh, and you have a choice when you bump up against that blue curve. You have a choice to go, do I want to face that shadow and do the work, or do I just want to compensate? Oh, I'll just kind of move that to the side and walk through it, but it's still in my real estate and it's still bugging me and it's still playing out. So if we decide to compensate and just like ignore it or bump it to the side, then that's going to sit in your mental real estate. It'll sit in there and sit in there and sit in there. Even your spiritual real estate, it'll sit in your field until it eventually gets resolved. And in my experience, if you're even halfway conscious, it'll grow. Like it'll start as that typical feather, rock, brick, truck, it'll grow in intensity until you do something about it. So we have to acknowledge the gaps in the Antakarana when we're trying to walk across this bridge and be in everyday life. What are the gaps? Where are they sitting? And can we meet our shadows head on as we cross the bridge? And they haven't got to be managed all at once. They can be managed bit by bit, doing that work slowly. And at different times of your life, different shadows will become resolved. Or sometimes there's layers to the one shadow. You do the big stuff first and then it lingers and there's still a few residual parts that you clean up. There's no race. You don't want to sprint. I do believe in doing the spiritual healing to alchemize the fractures. I think there's a lot you can do. And there's a lot of people in this class that do this work for people. So, yeah, there's a lot of stuff to be done with healing. And what I would recommend is you don't just go, oh, I'm broken, I need to be healed. That's not the case. Start with, what's my vision? What do I want? Where's my spirit wanting me to be brave and bold and excited and, well, not even excited, that's passionate and move forward. And then reverse engineer what's in the way. Because as soon as you set a vision for yourself that's deeply important to you, from your spirit, like the driver of the car is like, I want to take a left turn and go that way. Then as you're driving along the road, there'll be resistance and resource that comes up. So you have to work through obstacles and then take on the resources. It's just 101 of anything that you do. But the other thing to remember, this is the last point I'm going to make before we open up to Q&A. Remember your connection to source. Like this is, when spirit, source, higher self, you are bigger than this one lifetime. Like your ego needs to know that. Your ego needs to be put into its box sometimes. Hey, little guy, little girl, little one, you are one lifetime and you're very ungrown up. I am this bigger source energy and I've been through time and space and I've got this. And when you start to hand over those reins and operate from that point, you realize that there's lots of little mess ups your brain makes, but you capture them because you're looking down on it. So like this picture, she's up high. So I'm looking down upon that. I've got this. And so one of the things that we teach in one of our classes is we cover a lot of the practices and shadow work that we do. Whether there's three types of people that tend to do this work. People that just want to, they're spiritual seekers on the right hand side. They just want to know for themselves. They just want to take these shadowy parts out of their field and they just want to get it done. Then there's people that are in business leadership or people that do professional healing and practicing, and they're like, I've got to do this. I want to lead better. I want to be a better parent. I want to be a better practitioner. I want to do this work so that I approach my life from a different lens, and what I would say a spiritually mature ego. That's what you want. You want to approach your life from this new lens where there's a spirit guiding the ego to flex and to change and to grow, knowing that that ego is going to find difficulty and hard times along the way. Because you know what? It can be hard, especially if you're growing up in a family that have taught you this way. And then you get to like your 20s or 30s or 40s and you're like, oh, crap, there's another whole way to look at it. And we don't even know what we're programmed with. I'm sure I don't even know. I've got questions. Like I've still got questions around, oh, is that way of thinking actually who I am, or did I just learn that? So I'm always questioning, is that a program or is that really how I feel about things? And I reckon I've dug out quite a few of them, but I've still got them because you can't completely break free of, what society, country, culture you're brought up in. But what I do is I don't go looking for all of them. I don't go looking for all of them. I look for the ones that are in the way of a goal. I've got a vision, I've got a goal. So rather than going, I have to work on myself constantly, I'm actually no, I'm actually want that what's in the way, what's inhibiting me. And it's usually in the mind. Having said that, I'm also an advocate of exploring what is in the way, because sometimes it's not just our ego. Sometimes it's a past life issue or an ancestral burden that we're carrying. It's actually not ours, and we just need to like tidy it up.